Hi, this is Ishieba with the Horse Human Connection Matrix. And I have Charissa with me again for our part two. And we're going to pick up some of the conversation that we were having about. Let's start with the bullying and the shadow side, kind of where we left off. And
Yeah, we really did kind of end on a kind of a deep note and talking about the shadow side of the horse industry. And so I think for the sake of this recorded conversation, it might be helpful to set up some of the context around this bullying in the horse industry like thing. I'm gonna recap some things. So like if I take us back down to where I felt like we were, and I'm searching my own psyche for some archetypes to kind of like hold on to because we really are that deep, I think. We were having conversations about the difference between like a theory-based clinical approach and an evidence-based clinical approach. And maybe it's more of like the theory versus the method conversation. And that opened the door to my critique of the very behavioral approach to psychology in the horse industry. There's more to psychology than just the behavioral science part of it. And so, what a lot of people are exposed to right now in the animal science, behavioral science world is the influence of the behavioral school, which has a dark history and it has a political history. And it's not something that I'm comfortable with practicing because of that history. And so my psychological and theoretical orientation is more in the humanistic schools and the depth psychology schools. So more of like the person-centered humanistic school of psychology, which is kind of like a cousin or a sister to Jungian depth psychology. And it also has its own shadow. It has its limits. It's also like we could unpack that in a different conversation. But I feel more comfortable personally in that world than I do in the behavioral science world. So, and we were talking about how like theory is important because it informs how you answer the questions in front of you, and it informs how you're going to interpret the behavior in front of you. So, okay,
is
with
is it
that,
is
go ahead.
attachment theory part of theory? I mean, there's
Oh,
lots
yes,
of theories, right?
definitely. Yes. So that's one of the theories. And attachment theory kind of gets adopted into multiple schools of psychology. It's, and I know about it because of my training in family systems theory, in emotion focused therapy. And it's also very big in the early childhood development world. And so like attachment theory, this is where you hear like the basics of attachment theory is that what happens in the first early relationships that you have in life
Mhm.
kind of create a blueprint for how you engage in relationships later in life. And so if you have a secure base, and we talk about this a lot. So if you have a secure base attachment relationship with your caregivers as a baby, as an infant, as a child, it's really like the first 5 to 7 years of life that are pretty formative there. You're more likely to have harmonious relationship and be able to regulate yourself in relationship later in life. Okay, so we were talking about attachment theory and like the basics of it. And so like there's this ideas of different attachment styles and you can learn about that and use that to explore intimate relationship and like because of the implications of the neuroscience of human animal bond theory and interpersonal neurobiology, we can say that we have attachment relationships with our horses too,
Mhm.
and that we're going to play out those implicit, unconscious relationship patterns with our animals too. We're not on the topic of the bullying yet.
That's, I think that
Because we
that's
were,
important
it,
because the
yeah.
thing that came up, I started interacting and commenting on a Facebook video. And then I asked you to look at it and look at the comments. And you had some good perspective on it because your eye is so much more trained. You've been trained in so many more disciplines. And there was some bullying that was happening. People were calling these people abusive, and lots of them were
Mhm.
doing it. And some of them were doing it really aggressively. In fact, one of them had a picture
And
of a gun point, I'm going to do to you what you do to animals, with this like barrel of a gun picture in the comments. And I was just like, take that gun off me. What? You're just as bad as they are. And I know that I've gotten angry
right,
about stuff
right.
before too. And you're always so good to like say, well, hold on, there's the right way to do this. And you're so patient and tolerant with people at different levels of learning. And I just appreciate that.
Yeah. So we had this conversation. This was earlier today, and there was also people jumping on and saying, oh, this poster is so egotistical. That writer is so egotistical. And there's something about being egotistical that's now been demonized in the horse world, and rightly so, because again, if we think about the history of the development of the horse industry, and I think back a few decades, there was very much a need to call people out for being egotistical and abusive. Like there was very much a need to have that conversation and to have definitions of what constitutes abuse. And there was very much a need to challenge the egos of pretty successful trainers who would get in there and just enforce a horse into a frame and force it to go around. And you could tell these horses were just tight and tense and angry and resentful. So, I mean, there was a need for that in the past. And I think because new people continue to come to horses, there will always continue to be a need to have that conversation and to have a conversation about how deeply horses reveal ourselves and how deeply they are capable of mirroring us, and they will expose the all sorts of things, including the things that maybe we deny or hide about ourselves, including being manipulative and being egotistical and being like being forceful and things like that. So if I touch back down to why it's so important for me to not engage the behavioral school of psychology when I step into spaces with horses. And I got to the point where in this first conversation that we had, I found myself kind of surprised of how strongly I was protecting the space against that influence. And stepped away from our previous conversation feeling pretty justified in how protective I was being by saying, no, I can't let this into the circle. I cannot let this into the space. I must protect the integrity of the space that I have with the horse. Be-
Protect it, protect it from.
Behavioral psychology,
Okay,
like
we just want to be really clear.
yeah, yes. And the reason why is because, and I said this, let's unpack this, like that is the school of psychology that has been used by governments to oppress people.
And in horse training, it's used, a parallel is used to oppress horses, but that's not what you're saying. You're saying that you want to keep that away from horse therapy or away from your mind when you're interacting with the horse.
I think definitely from my mind when I'm interacting with the horse. And I think this is like probably a really personal conversation because a lot of the work that I do professionally is around works of decolonization and around works of like engaging liberation psychology and liberation theology and things like that. The path that I am on personally is one of questioning and challenging patriarchy,
Mhm.
which is a very, very normal stage of feminine development. We are born into a world, we're conditioned by that world, and then we rise up and are conscious enough to realize how deeply we've been manipulated as humans and as women.
Yeah.
And the horses have been too. And so that is a meeting place, and I would prefer to meet the horses in that space and have them be my teachers in that space than I would in instead of studying the systems of positive reinforcement and targeting and shaping and all those things.
Is it okay? There's a lot there, Carissa. Hold on.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Okay. Because I just
so
opened a really big door.
is it
Yeah.
fair? Is it okay? So we're talking about patriarchy. Is it fair to put a lot of horse training methods and liken them to patriarchy? Is that fair?
Yes. And I'm saying what I'm saying is that I think one of the well, yes. I mean, and if we think about the history of horsemanship, like women were not allowed to ride astride until the late 1800s. We were not even
In
allowed to
some
be on the
cultures,
back of a horse.
in some cultures.
Right. In well, and I'm speaking to dominant Western culture,
Okay.
which most of us listening, most of the people listening to this podcast
Mhm.
are coming from that culture. You and I come from that culture.
Right. And so that's fair. So the other thing that you were saying there that you want to keep out of your mind when you're with the horses, the things, the train, like clicker training and only positive reinforcement. Because as you were teaching me when you used to come out and give me
Mm-hmm.
lessons and we would meet, we had some conversations about clicker training and being able to use it as a tool if you have a relationship based training in place, but by itself it would run into some problems. And so you're also
Mm-hmm.
likening the clicker training and only positive reinforcement, because now we know, because horse brain, human brain, that horses actually have 6 different modes of learning. You're saying that those are part of the behavioral psychology also that you want to stay away from, keep out of your brain while you're with horses and in that space. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. And partly because behavioral psychology is a patriarchally dominated field. It is it is a very masculine method. And I'm saying masculine in kind of the more classical, like yin yang sense of the word masculine. It's a top-down approach where there is a hierarchy, there is dominance and influence, and I'm more interested in relating to nature and relating to the world and engaging with the world from a more like egalitarian circle, feminine space.
Bottom up. Yeah.
Yeah,
Starting organic and then manifesting to the mind as the last. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And
And
I will say, like, that's just my bias. And I'm saying, like, I know that I have my personal experiences that influence that bias.
right, owning that and knowing that you're looking at it through a lens, but it's the right lens for you to have on.
And it might not be the right lens for someone else. And
Right.
I understand, like, I do want to say that I believe that the behavioral sciences have progressed the conversation in horsemanship in my lifetime in a positive direction.
Mhm.
And it's limited in what it can accomplish. It's limited in its scope.
And yet, like earlier today when we were looking at that video, you were really defending some of those methods that, from my lens, which is not nearly as educated as yours is, from my lens, we're looking questionable when you're yanking a horse's neck and it looks like it could break its neck and the horse is flipping over backwards and it's
But
all
it didn't.
high
Okay, so
speed.
so it did not flip over backwards. The horse did not flip over. Okay, so in the video, what I remember seeing in the video was there was the comment in the subtext of the video was that there was a loose horse that was not halter broke, but it had a halter and lead rope on it.
Right.
And it was loose in a big open field, kind of on the boundary line of like undeveloped open land in a suburb.
Well, I saw three different clips, right? So I think like
Yeah.
this is worth talking about too. I mean, we're talking about perceptions, we're talking about lenses that we look through, we're talking about
Yes.
biases. All
Yes.
of these, like this is an example of all of those things. It's also an example of top down, bottom up. It's an example of feminine. An example of patriarchy. It's all of
Right.
these things in this example. So
Right. And this, right.
I'm
And
gonna
it's gonna get complicated because I'm also stepping in and saying, like, I think what we saw in that video was a healthy top-down patriarchal masculine action intervening to prevent chaos.
okay, and I'm going to say I'm not sure we're seeing the same thing because
Yeah.
there was the first scene, there is a horse being lassoed that
Yes.
has something on its face. It's
Yes.
blurry, and there's a house, like the horse is right next to a house. You can see
Right.
the house in the background. And what I saw was the horse's neck move, and then the horse, I didn't see it hit the ground, but I saw it come up off the ground in a very contorted, like airborne thing. And
Yeah.
then it cuts to a different scene, which is the middle scene, and it's a different horse and a different rider that are
I
lassoing the
don't know
horse.
if it is. I may have
It is
been
because the
a
man has
different
a red shirt.
camera.
Well, maybe it's the same man, but a different
Oh.
day because he's wearing a red shirt in one and a blue shirt in the other one. And
Oh,
the
interesting. Okay.
scene that you see is that there, it's again kind of blurry. There's a pasture, and then there's a road. And you can't tell because it's blurry if there's a fence between the pasture and the road. And the horse is
Got
again being
it.
lassoed, and your attention is on the action, but you're
Mhm.
aware of the background. And then the final scene is like from a GoPro where you're seeing the ears of a horse and from the rider's perspective, and he is
Yeah.
lassoing another horse with a halter and a lead rope flying.
Right.
It's open desert. There's no house, there's no road, it's just a desert scene.
Which could have, right. Okay, so there's three clips back to back to back in a sequence. I think the clip that is getting the most attention in the comments and that maybe elicits the most energy is that first one.
Mhm.
And what I saw was someone, there was a person roping a horse. And what I saw is that they threw an overhand loop. And I think like I'm not as much of an expert in roping to know the name of the type of the loop he threw, but he threw an overhand loop, and when you catch a horse and rope a horse, you have to throw the loop over the top of the horse's head, and then you want it to fall down over their face and onto their chest, which is what happened. And what I saw happen is when the top of the rope made contact with the top of that horse's neck, it fought it and reared up into it. At the same time, the loop is closing and tightening, and the guy dallies off because he needs the leverage of another horse to stop this animal. And it stops before we know what happens next. So we don't know where the release of pressure is coming from for this horse.
Or if it comes at
But
all. Right.
but what we do know is what I see is a horse moving and a horse and rider moving in parallel with it. So they're moving together. The rope lands on. The horse reacts to the rope, and then it's tethered to another horse. That's all I know. But
Okay.
because and this is something too. So like nature is violent.
Mhm.
Horse fought.
Right. And we don't know the before story or the after story. All we're given
Right.
is these three short things, which is really interesting.
Right,
The
right, right.
conversations that come in, to me, it's like, I'm not, I mean, I was judging it a little bit when I first saw it, but as I started to interact with the postings, I found myself asking questions, being curious, calling other people out and offering, like somebody said something, well, there's no other way to catch a wild horse in a pasture, which of course was this opportunity for me to, describe a way to do that, which then got a whole lot of attention. And it may have been a little bit off subject, but what I loved about the whole thing is that it was the video caused the conversations that I want to see
Yes.
happen.
Yes. And it was really lovely to watch you step up and engage that conversation. There has been kind of a collective evolution, especially since TikTok and COVID, and everyone has been on social media. I'm going to go back a few decades again. Early 2000s, that's when I first got introduced to the Pirellis and natural horsemanship as a concept. I had already learned quite a few other things from other people, and I remember the conversation back then was a respect for what the Pirellis were doing because, again, they were creating a pathway of invitation and learning to help new people enter the horse world. But those of us who were already there saw how short-sighted their teachings were. And even back then, people were predicting that natural horsemanship as a movement it was going to have a short lifespan because it, again, was a strict application of a method. And there's interviews out there with the Pirellis where they say, yeah, we're behavioralists. And they cite and study like B.F. Skinner and things like that. And they're doing what they can to change people's behavior in relationship to horses, which I think has a limited effect to it. But at the same time, they forgot a lot of the things that those of us who are generational horse families have learned.
It is, you're right. It is the same conversation with some different nuances. And you and I have talked about these training methods and about clinicians and, what my problem is with all of it too. But I mean, I just think, and maybe this is part of my autistic lens, but I think a lot of people that are doing like the YouTube videos and teaching the clinics, the whole setup seems wrong because you're in front of people. In order to do these things with the horse, you need to have an open heart. Like that's a big part of what I see going on. It's not just like the physical, I'll stand here, that will manipulate the horse to do this and that. It's doing it with an open heart. It's doing it with a connection with the horse. But the minute you step in front of a camera, the minute you step in front of a crowd and start talking, you're not in your heart. You're not in your body. Suddenly you're
Right,
a performer.
right.
And so there's a
Well,
huge
I do think
disconnect.
that there's some people who can,
Maybe.
but and I understand like there is a showmanship side to the industry. Like
Right.
horses have been used for entertainment for so long.
That's a good point.
Like there is that is a part of the craft.
It is, I get that. But I guess my problem is like if I'm going to a clinic to learn and I'm
Yes,
trying to learn what these people are doing and they've stopped doing what they normally do because
right.
they're in front of a crowd and somehow I'm supposed to understand what they're doing when it appears that they don't actually understand what they're doing on an energetic level. And nobody can explain that. That's my problem with clinics, clinicians. And it's kind of the same problem with this top down because it feels cut off in some ways. And so
Mm-hmm.
the whole thing is very problematic. So I'm actually glad to hear you say that somebody could see that it was short-sighted, because in my mind, I'd like it to be kind of history. It doesn't seem effective. It doesn't seem like the right thing to do. And I think Elsa Sinclair like brought the whole thing to a head,
Mm-hmm.
with Taming Wild, when she was
Mm-hmm.
a fourth level Pirelli student who made the movie,
Right.
the documentary about the Mustang, asking the question, can I ride? Will they let us ride? Do they want to be ridden?
Mm-hmm.
And then in the
That's
end,
a beautiful, beautiful documentary.
it is a beautiful documentary. But in the
Yeah.
end, she admits, yes, I'm not using a halter. I'm not using a round pen. I'm not using treats. I'm not using clickers. I'm doing this with relationship and with breath, but I'm also manipulating by where I stand, by where I breathe, by how I breathe. But
Right.
she's also entering their world. Like I feel like a lot of the ideas I have about entering the horse world and them having a separate culture come from some of her work, which
Yeah.
feels more, as I'm saying it, I'm thinking as I'm talking here, feels more like like a bottom up approach.
So let's go back and maybe we need to unpack the like top down, bottom up terminology because it gets used in different ways.
Okay.
So if we can like think about like there's top down learning and bottom up learning. Top down learning is a more cognitive approach to learning. A bottom up approach is more implicit. And when we say implicit, what it means is that we're tapping into areas of the consciousness that maybe don't have words. And so it requires us to be aware of the more subtle energies in our body and our emotional process, different states of being, and things like that. A basic way of breaking it down: body, heart, brain, or we can go brain, heart, body. So it's like action, feeling, thinking, or thinking, feeling, action. And we need both. We need both.
Yeah.
And the reason why I have a bias towards a more bottom up approach is that it gets forgotten and neglected, and it needs some cultural nurturing in my world. And so that's why I have a bias towards that practice. And and this is a challenging thought for some people. Like there are hierarchies in the world. A parent is above a child.
Mhm.
And right now we're going through some pretty big cultural shifts where we're exploring gender hierarchies. But I was born into a world and a religious system where man was above woman. And that's a challenge for me to sit with. I haven't completely abandoned that thinking, but I don't like it because I'm a woman. Like,
That's not the only reason. Come on.
well, I mean, okay, I have some more work I need to do around that personally. I have some integration to do. Like, but you're not pushing back and you're not challenging me when I say it, a parent is above a child.
I like that idea, but it's not the reality in the world anymore. In fact, that's a really big problem that I'm sure people come to see you for.
A lot of people are asking that question, yes. And actually, that is at the same time, though, there are ways when, like, if I'm in a therapy session with a child and it's just me and the child in the room, I am in charge of that space and I have a bigger body and I have more experience and I have more wisdom and I have more
Yeah,
knowledge.
except for Carissa, in any space
And
you're in that I've ever witnessed, whether there's big horses or men or just me, you are in charge. Like that's who you are.
well, it's also how I've been trained to operate.
Of course. From a
Yeah.
young age, from a
Right.
very young age.
Right. Right. So again, going back to this video though,
Mhm.
Like one of the comments that I had in the video is like, this is kind of like parenting, like roping that horse and getting it out of the housing development. I said was like, it's like grabbing the arm of a child and pulling it out of traffic
Mhm,
because there are children who don't know not to run into the road.
mhm.
And so I do need to be able to have my faculties. But the action of grabbing that child and pulling it out of traffic is not coming from a cognitive space. It's coming from a space of instinct.
With the child, yes. With that horse, like I'm still like you're saying housing development. I saw one house. And so like we're seeing things
That's true. That's
differently.
true.
And and I'm trying to imagine a situation, and maybe this is like off topic, but maybe it's not. I'm trying to imagine a situation where the horse has a lead rope and a halter on, and suddenly there's a cowboy with a rope. Like, what was that?
Mhm.
Were they riding? Did somebody fall off? Did the horse just get loose? Did somebody leave the gate open?
We
And like,
don't know.
right, we
Yeah, we
don't know
don't
any
know.
of that. And so, but when you're making the analogy with the parent and grabbing a child and it being like a knee jerk reaction to save a child or to save the horse, I'm not convinced that that's the same situation as what I'm saying.
I guess like the moment the energy of the video clip that we saw
Mm-hmm,
where this man is on a horse throwing the rope to catch another horse,
mm-hmm.
I think is the same kind of energy as like grabbing the arm of a child and pulling the back off the road.
Okay, yeah, I'll
But
with that.
and also like I've decided ahead of time if I'm gonna pull a child out of traffic, I've already decided ahead of time based on my years of conditioning and experience that this is the thing to do.
Mhm,
And so I've been trained by my culture that this is the right way, the right thing, and the heroic thing, the protective thing.
mhm. Why do you think so many people saw and commented on that being abuse? What do you think that's about?
The horse reared up and the rope did get tight.
And his neck got pulled over.
Yeah. So there was a use of force and manipulation.
We're not used to seeing that scenario either. Like we see horses roped in a corral or a large round pen,
Right,
and we see
right,
horses herded up with helicopters or
right,
driven, with multiple horsemen.
right.
We see cattle roped and tied in the rodeo world,
So
but we don't see horses roped in a large area running at full speed. We don't see that a
we
lot.
we used to see it more though. And that's again back to the shadow and the history of the industry.
Right.
Mm, Like it used to be legal. And this is why we have the legislation that was passed in the 1970s to protect the Mustangs, because it used to be legal before that legislation was passed to hunt them as sport.
What?
You don't know about that?
No, they were
Yeah,
hunting
no.
horses.
Yes. Well, there is an overpopulation problem. And it used to be legal to hunt them as sport. And this is where you hear about the practices like tripping. And so people would go and do the things that we saw in the video that you commented on decades ago before we were born
What kind of people
as
hunt horses? I'm sorry. I'm having a
it's
reaction.
difficult for me to answer that because I was alive then. I but I do think that a part of the outrage that still is coming up is like a ripple or an echo of the outrage from previous generations.
Even if we don't consciously know.
Right.
That's a lot. I'm getting
Right?
some goosebumps. That is a
Right.
lot.
and this is so it's like a parallel to the echoes that happen like when we engage with international politics and what's happening in Palestine and Israel, or when
Right.
and we are having these echoes of protests from the civil rights movement, and we're having these echoes of rebellion and are facing the shadow and the echoes of fascism in America. Like it feels kind of similar to that to me.
That's a really good point. This like microcosm, of course, is reflected in
The
in like
energetic
in
patterns.
even collective consciousness or DNA or generational whatever.
Exactly. Okay, I think we're on the same page.
Yeah, we're definitely on the same page.
Whew,
Okay, so
I'm getting the chills now too. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's really good to unpack all of that. How do you see the horses leading in work that feels therapeutic with them?
yeah, like well, maybe this kind of goes back to some of the questions that we've asked together before about like what is it that the horses are teaching us right now? What do they have to say for this time in human history? And I am a believer, based on my own experiences, that horses function like a psychopomp. And a psychopomp is like a mediator between worlds. And maybe it's the unconscious and conscious world, maybe it's the inner world and the outer world. Maybe we could go into different cultural practices and think about the tree of life in the underworld and the upper world of the heavens. They're a mediator and they help us travel. And whether it's traveling physically in the material world, like with a cart or a carriage or on their back, or whether they're traveling with us psychically and spiritually when we go and sit and meditate and just be with them, and then we have these amazing experiences. I do think they offer themselves in relationship with us to help facilitate that kind of movement.
Mhm. Wow, that's a great answer. I like on so many levels. I hadn't thought about it like that. I have another question for you. What five almost universal mistakes would you address to horse trainers and ask them to stop?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I don't know if I have five answers, but let me sit with that a little bit. I don't know. Let me see if I can anchor onto something.
We could also have the conversation that we started earlier today about the bumps and the spurs and the Grand Prix and these different, different levels of riding and what we see.
I think I like we could, and I think that's well, and I think maybe my answer to that is connected to the answer to the first thing you asked, which is circling back to the idea that we are all just where we are.
Mhm.
And I guess maybe my challenge and the question I'm asking myself right now, there is a natural order and harmony to everything that we see with horses and people. And sometimes it's really big and sometimes it's really quiet and invisible. And all of it is what it is, and all of it is what it needs to be.
Well, the edges of learning and the edges of good horseship and the edges and intersection of tolerance for other people of where we
Mhm.
are and
Yeah.
of wanting to learn the right things. Like I find myself wanting regulation or wanting, a 501 with people that can be called to educate people that are doing things that are unsafe to the horse. And at the same time, I also realized that even when these terrible things happen to horses, that there are lessons for the people. Like it doesn't feel like
Mhm.
it's ever on accident.
Yes. And like all accidents with horses, I will say like all accidents with horses are caused. And that is where we can step in with our human brain and learn how to be more preventative. And you know, we've got the work of Temple Grandin has been brilliant in order to improve the life of all animals and all livestock.
Mhm.
Like people have completely redesigned what healthy living looks like for horses. You know, I grew up when it what was normal was for a horse to live in a box stall and maybe get a couple hours of turnout a day. And the only movement that they got, or the only movement that they got was if they were taken out to be ridden that day. And that is what was necessary when horses lived a more urban life. And now horses don't live as much of an urban life as they used to. And so now what's normal is to have paddock paradises and big turnouts and things like that. And we've changed our feeding practices, and it is for the better of the horse. The horses are living longer. There's less colic than there used to be. But there's also new challenges because there's more laminitis and founder than there's ever been. And now there's like dental problems showing up that were never a problem in the past. So, I mean, the environment has changed, and now there's a new set of imbalances that are being exposed in this new environment. Does that make sense?
It does.
There's a new cycle.
Yeah, the balance is something that's always there, fighting to come back to homeostasis. Like, and it changes. And I mean,
Yes,
it's like us. Nothing really
it's
gets accomplished when you're in balance. Balance is something to return to after you've dipped or went for a high or accomplished something or whatever, whatever it is. It's the rest time. So yeah, why would we be there? But I love the part about what's going on in the world, showing up in small ways in people's psyches as we comment on Facebook. That's pretty profound. I mean, and it's very real. It's probably more
yeah.
real than all the stuff going on in the world.
And somehow like social media has now been a place for us to like work out a lot of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something too is cameras and the eye of the camera means that we can't hide anymore. There's being someone who wants to be in the horse industry means that you're gonna get watched, you're gonna be seen.
Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to control how we're seen or how it's
Mhm.
interpreted or all of that. Wow.
Yeah.
What so we're at about an hour again.
Oh
And
my gosh,
I
that
know.
went fast.
Whoop. It happens so quick. Is there anything else that you want to cover? I feel like, man, we talked about a lot of things that were important.
I think I imagine there's going to be more questions and we could do this again and talk more, but this feels like we've come up out of the depths of that heaviness that we ended on
Yes.
last time
Yes.
and are maybe more, that feels complete.
Yeah, I like that too. I guess that's a good place to say goodnight.
Sounds good.